explosion in Venezuela, limited facts, rising speculation, and a familiar question: does this push Washington and Caracas closer to confrontation or back toward a fragile, pragmatic engagement? In a country that holds the world's largest proven oil reserves, any serious blast is never just a local story. It instantly becomes a test of U.S.-Venezuela relations, a risk signal for global energy markets, and another shock for a population already living with hyperinflation, shortages, and mass emigration. On trading floors, the questions are blunt. Could this disrupt Venezuelan oil flows? Will Washington tighten sanctions again? How might this reshape crude prices, energy stocks, and emerging market risk? And far from markets, Venezuelan families are asking, will this mean more blackouts, longer fuel lines, eager prices, and another wave of people leaving? In the next few minutes, we'll separate what's known from what's claimed, examine the human and financial impact, place this incident in the broader U.S.-Venezuela story, revisit Donald Trump's role, and outline what global investors should be watching now. At the time of this recording, public information about the blast remains incomplete. 3 points are clear. First, Venezuelan authorities have acknowledged that a significant explosion occurred on Venezuelan territory. It is being treated as a serious incident, not a minor malfunction. Second, the government has announced a formal investigation. Security forces, intelligence agencies, and technical teams are reportedly involved in on-site forensic work and evidence gathering. Third, officials have promised further details, but many key elements have not yet been clearly disclosed in the public domain. What is still unclear or disputed includes the precise location and nature of the affected site. Whether it was a purely industrial facility, infrastructure node, or something strategically sensitive. The exact casualty count, if any, which early in such events is often incomplete or revised, and most importantly, the cause. Whether technical failure, negligence, criminal activity, or a politically motivated act. In a highly polarized environment, political actors move fast to frame events. Some may claim sabotage, foreign interference, or opposition plots. Others may point to regime incompetence, corruption, or cover-ups. At the Stahi, those claims mostly fall into two categories: alleged assertions about perpetrators, motives, or foreign links that are not supported by publicly verifiable evidence, and under investigation technical and intelligence findings that have not yet been transparently presented. What can be said with confidence is narrow. A blast has occurred. The state is treating it as serious, and a full, independently corroborated narrative of who, how, and why is not yet in the public record. For Venezuelans, the impact is immediate and concrete. Any significant explosion in a fragile state typically hits 3 fronts: safety, services, and social stability. On safety and health, if the blast took place near populated areas or industrial facilities, there is a real risk of injuries, deaths, and environmental contamination. Venezuela's healthcare system has been severely weakened. Hospitals often lack medicines, equipment, and sometimes even reliable electricity. That means even a moderate number of casualties can strain local capacity. On infrastructure and essential services, years of underinvestment, mismanagement, and sanctions have left key systems: refineries, pipelines, power plants, transmission lines. A serious incident can destabilize the power grid and trigger blackouts or brownouts, interrupt fuel distribution and worsen gasoline and diesel shortages, and disrupt transport and logistics. If roads, depots, or ports are affected, for ordinary people, that quickly shows up as longer fuel queues, higher transport costs, unreliable electricity, and more difficulty keeping businesses open or food stocked. In an already fragile economy, small disruptions ripple quickly through prices and availability. On the psychological and social side, Venezuelans have endured years of political standoff, economic collapse, and rising crime. A high-profile explosion under a cloud of uncertainty deepens the sense that the future is unpredictable. That uncertainty can encourage more people to consider leaving, adding to an already massive diaspora, and push those who remain further into survival strategies: informal work, dollarized microtransactions, and dependence on remittances sent from abroad. So while international observers debate sanctions and strategy, many Venezuelans experience this as one more shock layered onto daily instability. Global markets, however, view the incident through a different lens: flows, risk, and policy. Whenever something goes wrong in an oil-producing state, traders ask a simple question: does this change supply, or the politics that control supply? Venezuela's current output is a fraction of its historical peak, but its reserves are enormous, and its heavy crude matters to specific refineries, particularly in the U.S. Gulf Coast, that were configured for that quality. Even the perception of increased risk to its infrastructure or political stability can nudge prices and prompt portfolio adjustments. The impact tends to appear across several channels. In oil and energy equities, if traders perceive a risk of physical damage, sabotage, or likely sanctions tightening, Brent and WTI can pick up a modest geopolitical premium, benefiting integrated oil majors and some independent producers with leverage to benchmark prices. While energy-intensive sectors, airlines, logistics, chemicals, some industrials may soften on fears of higher input costs. In emerging markets and Latin America, Venezuela is largely shut out of mainstream bond markets, but regional risk is interconnected. Sovereign spreads in neighboring countries and wider Latin American equity indices can widen as global funds reduce risk or add hedges. Countries heavily impacted by Venezuelan migration may face investor questions about fiscal pressure, social stability, and political backlash. On currencies and safe havens, periods of elevated geopolitical uncertainty typically support the US dollar, treasuries, and, to a degree, gold, while MFX, particularly in Latin America, can see pressures, carry trades, or trimmed. Markets may also reassess the outlook for countries tightly linked to Venezuelan trade or remittance flows. Defense and security-related names can gain support as investors lean into a broader narrative of fragmented geopolitics and the need to protect critical infrastructure. One incident in Venezuela is unlikely, on its own, to reset the global energy balance, but it can act as a catalyst accelerating or delaying decisions on sanctions, licenses, and investment that matter over the next 1, 2, 3 years. To see how we need the broader U.S.-Venezuela context. Under Hugo Chavez, Venezuela cast itself as a sharp critic of U.S. policy, cultivated ties with Russia, Iran, and China, and used oil revenues for domestic programs and regional influence, even as it continued selling large volumes of crude to the U.S. The Obama administration introduced targeted sanctions against specific officials and, in 2015, labeled Venezuela a national security threat. Yet oil trade largely continued. The major shift came under Donald Trump. Between 2017 and 2020, his administration imposed sweeping sanctions on PDVSA and related entities, restricted U.S. purchases of Venezuelan crude, and access to U.S. financial markets. Recognized opposition leader Juan Guaido as interim president to delegitimize Nicolas Maduro internationally and used strong rhetoric about regime change, signaling that political transition in Caracas was an explicit goal. These moves, combined with years of governance failures, accelerated Venezuela's economic contraction, slashed its oil output, and helped fuel a historic migration wave. The Biden administration has modified but not dismantled that framework. It has maintained core sanctions while testing targeted relief via specific licenses for energy projects, tried to link limited sanctions easing to political or electoral concessions from the Maduro government, and framed its approach around democracy promotion, humanitarian concerns, energy security, and migration management. This leaves Venezuela in a gray zone. Partially sanctioned, partially engaged, still heavily constrained. A serious explosion in this context can steer policy in one of two directions. Toward tighter pressure if Washington reads it as a sign of instability, criminal networks, or malign foreign activity that justifies stricter enforcement or new measures. Or toward managed engagement if it underscores how fragile the system has become and the risks of further collapse for humanitarian conditions, regional stability, and migration flows. Donald Trump's role in this story is both historical and potentially future-oriented. As president, he adopted the most aggressive U.S. stance on Venezuela in modern times, emphasizing maximum economic pressure through comprehensive sanctions, diplomatic isolation of Maduro, in favor of an opposition-led interim government and political messaging that presented Venezuela as a warning about socialism and authoritarianism. As of now, there is no widely reported, detailed, and verifiable public statement from Trump specifically about this recent blast. But his broader position on Venezuela is well established. Support for tough sanctions, rejection of Maduro's legitimacy, and skepticism toward engagement. For investors and foreign governments that matters because the sanctions system currently shaping Venezuela's economy is largely a product of his term, and if a future U.S. administration adopted a similarly hard line or if Trump himself returned to office, markets would likely price in a higher probability of more rigid sanctions, enforcement, and less flexibility for negotiated relief. For global investors, the immediate impact of this incident is primarily about sentiment and risk adjustment. Modest changes in oil prices as traders reprice geopolitical risk, volatility in Latin American assets as portfolios rebalance, and some rotation into defensives and safe havens. If risk appetite dips, the medium to long-term questions are larger. Does this incident accelerate or delay any normalization of Venezuela's role in global energy markets? Does it push U.S. policy toward more confrontation, or toward a structured deal that trades political steps for economic breathing space? And how does Venezuela fit into a world already dealing with constrained Russian supply, Middle East risk, and an uneven energy transition? Investors should be watching OFAC announcements and U.S. Treasury guidance new designations, license changes, or enforcement actions connected to Venezuelan entities. Official rhetoric from Washington, including the tone from the White House, State Department, and key members of Congress on sanctions, energy, and migration. Shipping and export data to see whether Venezuelan crude flows remain steady, fall, or and corporate commentary from oil majors, refiners, and service companies on their Latin American exposure and political risk assumptions. Key sectors to monitor include global oil and gas, especially those with leverage to heavy crude and Latin American assets, regional banks and corporates in countries absorbing large numbers of Venezuelan migrants, and defense security and infrastructure protection firms, if states respond by hardening assets and borders. Ultimately, this blast matters because it sits at the intersection of three broader trends. The fragility of sanctioned petro-states, the return of geopolitics to the center of energy markets, and the way U.S. domestic politics, from Trump's legacy to today's debates, can shape outcomes far beyond American borders. The crucial questions now are whether this incident becomes another justification for deeper isolation or a catalyst to rethink whether pressure without a clear exit path is sustainable. How Washington balances punishing authoritarian behavior with securing affordable energy and managing migration. And inside Venezuela, whether this strengthens official narratives of control or further erodes public confidence in already fragile institutions. In the weeks ahead, watch not just the headlines from Caracas and Washington, but the data that markets care about most: oil flows, sanctions, notices, spread movements, and currency trends. An explosion is a moment, its consequences for energy, for regional stability, for investors, and for millions of ordinary people will unfold over years.